Alright, hello and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Lahori Talks. Today there's going to be a slightly different style in terms of the video that I'm recording right now. Keeping in mind the recent events in Israel and Palestine as well as in Jerusalem, I noticed that around a week ago, Mr. Benjamin Aaron Shapiro, who is an American political commentator as well as a media anchor and runs his own show on the Daily Wire, known as the Ben Shapiro Show, as you can see with the image on screen. He came up with two videos on the conflict, and I didn't see anybody refuting or addressing some of the things that he said in these videos. As a matter of fact, if you go to his channel and check the comments, a lot of people are supporting what he said, even though a lot of the things that he said were wrong or completely biased. So I felt like it was necessary for me with my platform to respond to some of the things that Mr. Shapiro has stated, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So in this first video, Mr. Shapiro begins by trying to justify the actions of the Israeli government with the evictions that they did of the people that lived in Sheikh Jarrah. So I'm going to play this clip right now, and then we'll be hearing my opinion on it.
Now, the pretext for all of this is the eviction of some Palestinian families from Sheikh Jarrah, from homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, they're allowed to live elsewhere. They're just not allowed to live in these particular homes because they don't have legal deed to these homes. There's been a string of decisions going all the way back to 1970 by Israeli courts suggesting that people who have the original legal deeds to these homes have the ability to charge rent to the people living in the homes.
All right, so a couple of things that we need to address. First of all, Sheikh Jarrah is a region that is in East Jerusalem. Now, if we don't even have to go too much in the past, if we just look at the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 67/19 of December 2012, and we read through preambulatory clauses 7, 9, 10, and 12, we'll clearly see that it is stated that there is a strict need for Israel to withdraw from East Jerusalem, and that it is not recognized by the international community as part of Israel. Mind you, this General Assembly resolution in its preambulatory clauses contained references to various other resolutions by the United Nations in the past that were created for this conflict in the first place. So it's very obvious that East Jerusalem is not under the jurisdiction of Israel. So for Mr. Shapiro to say that these people were evicted because they did not have a legal deed from the Israeli court, I think it's important for him to understand that the Israeli court only has jurisdiction within the borders of Israel. East Jerusalem is beyond those borders. It is not under the jurisdiction of any Israeli court. Therefore, it is completely incorrect for Mr. Shapiro to state that the people living in Sheikh Jarrah require a legal deed from the Israeli court. East Jerusalem, under international law, is not a part of Israel. This has also been stated by the United Nations Human Rights Watch spokesperson, Rupert Neville. You can Google and find his exact statements on this as well, and you will see that what I'm saying is actually completely correct. Now let's move on ahead and see what other things Mr. Shapiro has to say.
Because it is well coordinated in advance. Fatah is supposed to hold elections. This is the Palestinian Authority armed military wing. They were supposed to hold elections. They didn't hold elections because they knew they were going to lose. So instead, they've decided to ram up the level of violence. So, for example,
so in this clip here, Mr. Shapiro is trying to say that the violence that has then occurred after the actions of Israel was all pre-planned by Fatah and Hamas. And the reason for that was because Fatah was going to fight in the elections and they were going to lose, so they wanted to gain the support of the people. And so they did this, and it's completely ridiculous. And I'm pretty sure what he's saying is completely incorrect, but just to put this into perspective, I think Mr. Shapiro has no right to say anything about manipulation in elections and trying to gain the support of the people via violence when Israel has a prime minister like Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been known for making deals and making plenty of agreements with extremist far-right people in the Israeli government and allowing them to go ahead with violence or inciting hatred towards the Palestinians just to gain their support and their votes for the elections. Benjamin Netanyahu was losing his support in the recent elections. I believe he even lost a couple of seats in their Senate. And that's precisely why this entire thing sprung up with evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and the attacks on Masjid al-Aqsa. And if you guys don't believe me, you can watch the Mehdi Hassan show on the Peacock and his coverage on this entire conflict. And he mentions this several times as well. And, you know, this is not something new. This has been going on for almost a decade now, where every time Benjamin Netanyahu loses the support of his people, he begins to make agreements with extremist far-right people and allows them to incite people towards violence.
Hundreds hurt in clashes at Aqsa Mosque as tension rises in Jerusalem. Really, hundreds hurt in clashes, were they? They're just clashes that happen. Well, what if I told you that Hamas and Fatah terrorists had used Al-Aqsa as a staging ground in order to ignite violence because they know the media will cover it this way? There's been a feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for literally decades at this point. All of this is pre-planned. This is perfectly obvious. So, for example, here are some pictures. We were told, by the way, it's just a bunch of people peacefully praying inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, here's the thing. I've been up to the Temple Mount. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is open all the time. And the only reason there are any restrictions put on people getting up to the Temple Mount is because the Israeli authorities knew that terrorists were infiltrating the Temple Mount. That is literally the only reason. And so they put up some sort of fencing, and then the Palestinians got mad, so they took down the fencing for 2 days. And then the Palestinians still got mad. So it turned out it wasn't about the fencing at all. So you have a bunch of particularly young Arab men who went up into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they brought with them giant piles of rocks.
All right, so 3 things that I want to say about this. First of all, Mr. Shapiro is calling what happened as clashes. I think that's entirely wrong. What happened cannot be considered as clashes when one side is fighting with stun grenades and M4 rifles and water guns with sewerage water in them and tasers and body armor, whereas the other side barely has stones and is mostly running away, to be honest. There aren't any clashes that are happening when more than 200 Palestinians are being killed in a week, or less than that perhaps. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, the premise that Mr. Shapiro has is that all of this was somehow pre-planned by Hamas or Fatah is entirely wrong, because how can you tell me that an organization that, by the way, Mr. Shapiro himself in this video consistently calls as a terrorist organization or a militant group, had the intelligence and the resources to predict that Israel would evict people from Sheikh Jarrah and that they would attack Masjid al-Aqsa and then they would make their move? I don't think that that is possible, and I think that is completely ridiculous to say. Thirdly, the picture that Mr. Shapiro has on his screen, he states that this is a picture from long before May 7th, when in reality this is a picture from after May 7th. And first of all, he's saying that these rocks were being used to attack the soldiers from IDF. And I disagree, because if you look at all of the footage that was from the day of the attack on Masjid al-Aqsa, you will not find a single rock that is the size of what is currently being shown on screen. Secondly, I don't think that these rocks were being used to attack the soldiers at IDF, because these rocks are so big that throwing them at a long distance would not really be possible. So I don't think that the Palestinians or the people in this mosque brought rocks this big to defend themselves to throw at the police. But okay, for the sake of argument, I'll play devil's advocate. For the sake of argument, let's say that they even did do so. Considering the fact that this is a picture from after the first raid on the mosque, it's completely inaccurate to blame them, because when they already know that the mosque has been raided once, it's very likely that it's going to happen again, and it did happen again on May 10th, by the way. So it's very normal for them to bring some sort of weapon, or in this case a rock, to defend themselves in case that happens again. Because, I mean, you wouldn't want to go into a mosque knowing that the IDF is going to throw stun grenades at you, or they're going to arrest your children, and you wouldn't want to go there without anything to defend yourself. But this is, again, assuming the fact that these rocks were even being used for violence. But if you look at the size and you look at the color, and the color being completely the same as the colors of the walls of the mosque, it's very likely that some part of the mosque was damaged during the first raid by the IDF on 7th May. And these are basically rocks that fell off. But anyway, let's move on to the second video. I don't think there's any point in me continuing with the rest of this video, because Mr. Shapiro basically repeats the words pre-planned by Hamas, throwing rocks, pre-planned by Hamas, throwing rocks over and over and over again, and just shows footage and clips and pictures. And if you don't believe me, feel free to go to Mr. Shapiro's channel, and you can go ahead and watch the rest of this video. It will be exactly as I'm telling you. Anyway, let's move on to video number 2.
So he canceled the elections in late April and blamed the Jews because this is
Okay, I mean, let's just watch that again.
going to lose. So he canceled the elections in late April and blamed the Jews because...
Right. So this is basically what Mr. Shapiro can do when he runs out of arguments, is he does things like these. I'm sure CNN will find a way to label Mr. Shapiro as an anti-Semitic person as well.
Of the Gaza Strip completely. Remember, Israel had Jewish areas of the Gaza... There were Jewish areas in the northern Gaza Strip. There were these little cities in the northern Gaza Strip. They had greenhouses. They were quite prosperous. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew in order, supposedly, to push for a new peace deal.
All right, so now here Mr. Shapiro mentions the pulling out of the Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip as some sort of favor. I think Mr. Shapiro is forgetting that Israel does not belong in this region in the first place. If we take a look at it historically, Israel has not existed before 1948. Israel had not existed on the face of the earth. The name had not been heard for 2,000 years. In 63 BC, the Roman Empire conquered the area that is known as modern-day Palestine. And I don't know what the name was before that. Let's assume it was Israel. Let's assume it was Israel. And the Romans changed the name to Philistina, which meant the world of the Philistines. And as time progressed and more Arabs sought refuge and actually began to make civilization and their settlements in this area, especially in the future with the Islamic Empire and the various different castes of the Islamic Empire having control, such as the Umayyads and so on and so forth. The name changed from Philistina to Palestine, and up until before 1948, it was still known as Palestine. The word Israel, the country Israel, only came to being after 1948, and that was because of the United Kingdom allowing a large number of Jews to come and settle into this region because they were losing the war in World War II and they needed support of the various different Jewish soldiers from across the world, and they promised them a homeland in the region of Palestine under the Balfour Declaration. So I think it's completely arrogant for Mr. Shapiro to think that they did some sort of favor when, if you look at it historically speaking, Israel was not a thing for 2,000 years until 1948. They don't belong in that region in the first place. Their claim, if you look at it from this perspective, is 2,000 years old to the land. That is what their claim is. Anyway, let's move on.
An agency specifically dedicated toward fostering Palestinian extremism, that the United States would restore $290 million worth of foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority, much of which would be used for terrorism and fostering of terrorism.
All right, so in this clip right here, Mr. Shapiro mentions that the UNRWA, which is an agency of the United Nations that was created to support Palestinian refugees, is being used to foster extremism or Palestinian terrorism. Now, let's look at this from a factual perspective, because Mr. Shapiro does not have any facts to back up what he's saying. UNRWA is an agency of the United Nations that has supported 5.6 million refugees in Palestine to this day. They're responsible for educating 500,000 students, and in extremely recent times, in the past year or two, they're responsible for setting up 20 to 30 health facilities within the region, providing basic health care, helping pregnant women, especially those with difficulties, diabetic patients, and so on and so forth. So for an agency of the United Nations to be called as someone who is fostering extremism and terrorism, this is territory that one must be very careful when they're treading on. Because I think Mr. Shapiro is forgetting that if he is blaming the United Nations for fostering extremism and terrorism, it is the very United Nations that is responsible for the legitimacy, should it exist, of the state of Israel. So Mr. Shapiro, when you're blaming the United Nations for terrorism and extremism, I think that tells us a lot about the state that you are currently defending in your video.
Ashdod, you'd be talking about at most 30 seconds of warning time. If you're talking about Gaza to Jerusalem, you're talking about 1.5 minutes of warning time, about 90 seconds of warning time. If you're talking about to Tel Aviv, about the same, a little bit under 90 seconds of warning time. That means that if you're woken up at 3 a.m. by a rocket siren going off, you now have 90 seconds to grab your kids and get down into a bomb shelter before the rockets start to hit.
All right, so this is fair from Mr. Shapiro that he is mentioning that the people in Israel do not have a lot of time to respond to the rocket fire from Hamas. And I'm not going to sit here and condone Hamas's action. I don't think firing rockets into Israel was the solution in this case. I think any reasonable person obviously would disagree with the actions of Hamas. However, I think that it's entirely biased for Ben Shapiro to only be stating this fact for Israel. I mean, let's talk about it from a Palestinian perspective. He was giving the example of someone in 3 a.m. being woken up by rocket sirens. The Palestinians do not have this privilege. They're not going to be woken up by a rocket siren or a warning. They don't have the Iron Dome to intercept the precision missiles and airstrikes that Israel has launched on them. They don't get 15 to 3 minutes of warnings. They're woken up by their building collapsing, or they pretty much die in their sleep. And mind you, these are innocent civilians and children that are being killed here. Even though the Israeli government time and time again says that they're only targeting Hamas targets, that's entirely untrue, and that has become very obvious as the situation has progressed. So if Mr. Shapiro is mentioning warning times for Israel, I think it's important for me to mention that Palestine does not have this privilege. And they do not have the military infrastructure, the multi-trillion-dollar military infrastructure that has been backed by the United States of America and various different Western countries that Israel has, to have a privilege of something as simple as a rocket siren or an underground bunker to protect themselves.
Okay, so Hamas started this conflict. Hamas clearly started the conflict. And now Israel has no choice. And no country can sustain this.
Alright, so this is the last clip that I'm going to play from all of Mr. Shapiro's videos. I don't see the point in continuing with this. But again, he's continuing with this premise that everything was caused by Hamas, and Hamas is the reason this entire conflict began. But the thing is, Mr. Shapiro, Hamas did not ask you to evict people from East Jerusalem, even though East Jerusalem is not under the jurisdiction of Israel. Hamas did not ask you to raid Masjid al-Aqsa in the holy month of Ramadan when you knew that the maximum amount of people praying would be present at the mosque during this time. So I think it's completely unfair for Mr. Shapiro, for the Western media, for Israeli media to come forward and try to pit this all on Hamas or Fatah or the Palestinian people, when in reality it was Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, to protect his interests, to ensure his victory in the next elections, to gain the support of the extremist far right. He was the one who incited violence towards the Palestinians, who allowed all of these things to take place, and if anyone, he is the one to blame for what has occurred after that. Again, I do not condone the actions of Hamas or the rocket fire, but I think that it is completely inaccurate, completely biased, that people like Ben Shapiro, who are political analysts by name, are trying to blame this entirely on a militant group, when in reality that is definitely not the case. Well, with that said, I think I've answered most of everything that I wanted to in terms of Mr. Shapiro's videos. And a general advice for the people that are currently listening is that don't just take my word or Mr. Shapiro's word or any other political analyst's word when they are talking about certain aspects of an issue. It's important for you to do your own research, for you to delve into the depths of a topic and try to understand it from an historical standpoint and look at it from both sides, and then come up with your own opinion and come up with understanding what is right and what is wrong. And I think that is somewhere that we all lack and somewhere that we all can improve, instead of blindly following people that we think are great analysts or great political commentators. I think it's important for us in this day and age where information is everything that we do our own research and we try to understand what's actually going on in the situation ourselves. But with that said, thank you very much everyone for watching and listening in. I hope you gained a thing or two from this video. And if you enjoyed what you see, be sure to like our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content from the Lahori Talks page. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you all a very good day.